The blood on Francesca Garrett's hands wouldn't wash clean, no matter how hard she scrubbed them in the basin, and when she finally lifted them from the cold water, they shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the wooden table to steady herself. St. Joe, Missouri. In the spring of 1867 was supposed to be her fresh start, a place where she could leave behind the memories of the war that had taken her father and brother, where she could build something new with just her needlework and her determination to survive. The little room above the general store cost her nearly everything she had saved, but it was hers, and that morning she had promised Mrs. Henderson down at the church that she would mend the altar cloth before Sunday service. 3 days. She had 3 days to complete work that her trembling hands now made impossible. She pulled the delicate white fabric from her satchel and spread it across the table, examining the torn seam that ran nearly 6 inches along the hem. Simple work under normal circumstances. The kind of repair she could have completed in an hour before the war, before she had spent 2 years nursing wounded soldiers in a field hospital outside of Vicksburg, before she had held down screaming men while surgeons sawed through bone, before she had written letters to mothers whose sons would never come home. Her hands had been steady then, steady even when everything around her dissolved into chaos and blood and death. But something had broken inside her during those final months, and now the trembling came at the worst possible moments, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. She threaded the needle on her 5th attempt, holding her breath and bracing her right wrist with her left hand, but the moment she brought the needle to the fabric, her fingers spasmed and sent it clattering to the floor. A sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a laugh, and she pressed her palms flat against the table, willing them to stillness. The afternoon sun slanted through her single window, casting long shadows across the room, and she knew she was running out of daylight. Candles cost money she didn't have to spare. She tried again, and again. By the time the sun touched the horizon, she had managed exactly 4 stitches, each one crooked and uneven, and she knew she would have to tear them out and start over. The tears came then, hot and frustrated, and she let them fall onto the white fabric as her hands continued their relentless trembling. She was 23 years old, and she felt ancient, worn down by memories and exhaustion and the constant fear that she would never be whole again. The knock at her door startled her so badly she knocked over the basin, sending water cascading across the floor. She scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with her apron, trying to compose herself before opening the door. She expected Mrs. Henderson checking on her progress, or perhaps the landlord come to collect next week's rent early. She did not expect the man who stood in the narrow hallway, so tall and broad-shouldered that he seemed to fill the entire space, his hair dark and hanging past his collar, his face weathered by sun and wind, and what looked like 100 nights spent sleeping under open sky. "Miss Garrett?" His voice was deep, rough around the edges, but not unkind. "Name is Owen Pierce. Mrs. Henderson sent me." Francesca stared at him, trying to make sense of his presence. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt, and she could see the muscles in his forearms where he had rolled up his sleeves despite the spring chill. A mountain man, she thought, though what a mountain man was doing in St. Joe in the middle of April, she couldn't begin to guess. Most of them stayed in the high country trapping beaver and living wild, only coming to civilization when they needed supplies or whiskey or both. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would Mrs. Henderson send you?" "Said you were doing some mending for the church. Said you might need help with something." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable in the confined space of the hallway. "I know it sounds strange, a man offering to help with needlework, but my ma taught me before she passed. Figured it was a useful skill to have when you spend most of your time alone in the mountains." Francesca felt heat rise to her cheeks. Had Mrs. Henderson told him about her condition? About her useless, trembling hands? The thought made her want to close the door in his face, to retreat into her room and her shame and figure this out on her own the way she had been doing for months. But something in his steady gaze stopped her, something that suggested he had seen his own share of troubles and wouldn't judge her for hers. "I can manage," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Owen Pierce looked past her into the room, his eyes taking in the overturned basin, the wet floor, the altar cloth spread across the table with its pathetic 4 crooked stitches. When his gaze returned to her face, she saw understanding there, and something else she couldn't quite name. Respectfully, Miss Garrett, looks like you could use a hand. I promise I'm not here to cause trouble or take advantage. Mrs. Henderson is waiting downstairs, if that makes you feel more proper about the situation." Francesca hesitated, then stepped aside to let him enter. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe, and once inside her small room, he seemed even more massive, his presence filling the space in a way that should have felt threatening, but somehow didn't. He moved carefully, deliberately, as though he was used to being too large for civilized spaces and had learned to make himself smaller through sheer force of will. "The hem needs mending," she said, gesturing to the altar cloth. "Simple straight stitch. She held up her hands, and right on cue they began to tremble. "They do this, since the war. I was a nurse, and I suppose I saw too much, and now I cannot seem to make them stop." Owen set his hat on the table and studied her hands for a moment without speaking. Then he pulled out the second chair and sat down, his long legs stretching out beneath the table. "My brother came back from the war with a tremor in his left hand. Couldn't hold a rifle anymore, which near about killed him since he'd been the best shot in our family. Doctor said some men's nerves get damaged by what they see, same as a body can get damaged by bullets or disease." "Did it get better?" Francesca asked, sitting down across from him. "Your brother's hand?" "Some. He learned to work around it, found other things he could do." Owen picked up the needle and thread, examining them in the fading light. "He runs a stable in Denver now. Says horses don't care if your hand shakes, long as you treat them fair." He threaded the needle on his first try, his thick fingers surprisingly dexterous, and positioned the altar cloth in front of him. But instead of beginning to sew, he set the needle down and looked at Francesca with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Mrs. Henderson told me you promised to do this work yourself, that it matters to you to keep your word. So here's what I'm thinking. You do the sewing, and I will help keep your hands steady, if you are willing." Francesca felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The offer was intimate in a way that made her acutely aware of how alone they were in this room, how improper the situation would seem to anyone who knew about it. But she thought about the altar cloth and her promise, about the small reputation she was trying to build in this town as someone reliable, someone skilled, someone worth hiring. She thought about the rent that was due, and the empty larder, and the long line of tomorrows stretching out before her, each one requiring her to find a way forward despite her broken nerves. "All right," she whispered. Owen moved his chair around the table until he sat beside her, close enough that she could smell pine and wood smoke and fresh air clinging to his clothes. He picked up the needle and placed it carefully in her right hand, then covered both of her hands with his own. His palms were warm and calloused, his grip firm but gentle, and the moment his hand settled over hers, the trembling stopped. Completely. As though his presence alone was enough to quiet whatever storm raged inside her nervous system. "I am here," he said quietly, and something in those 3 words made Francesca want to cry all over again, but for an entirely different reason. She took a shaky breath and brought the needle to the fabric. With Owen's hand steadying hers, she pierced the cloth and drew the thread through, creating a single perfect stitch. Then another, and another. They worked in silence as the room grew darker, and when the light finally failed completely, Owen released her hands long enough to light the candle on the table, using matches from his pocket. The small flame cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the surprising gentleness in his dark eyes. "How long have you been in the mountains?" Francesca asked as they resumed their work, needing to fill the silence with something other than the sound of her own heartbeat. "Near about 10 years. Went up when I was 18, after my pa died. Needed to be away from people for a while, away from everything that reminded me of what I had lost." He paused, watching their joined hands move across the fabric. "Turns out I was good at being alone, good at reading weather and tracking game, and surviving on nothing but what I could carry or catch. Made decent money trapping, enough to send some back to my ma and brother before Ma passed 3 years ago." "What brings you down from the mountains now?" "Beaver are trapped out in most places. The good money is gone, and I'm getting too old to spend another winter eating jerky and talking to myself." A smile ghosted across his face. "Thought maybe it was time to try living around people again, see if I still remembered how." "And do you remember how?" He met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her stomach flutter. Starting to think I might want to learn again. They worked for another hour, completing nearly half the torn seam. Francesca's hands remained steady as long as Owen held them, and she found herself marveling at how natural this felt, how right, despite having known this man for less than 2 hours. When she finally suggested they stop for the night, worried about straining his patience, Owen nodded and carefully released her hands. The trembling returned immediately, but somehow it felt less defeating now, less permanent. "Same time tomorrow?" Owen asked, standing and retrieving his hat. "We can finish it before your deadline." "You don't have to do this," Francesca said. "I know you must have other things that need doing." "Nothing that matters more than helping someone keep their word," Owen replied. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "My ma used to say that broken things can still be useful, still be beautiful, long as someone is willing to work with them instead of throwing them away. Think she was right about that." After he left, Francesca sat at the table for a long time, staring at the altar cloth and the neat line of stitches they had created together. She flexed her fingers, watching them tremble in the candlelight, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair when she looked at her own hands. She felt hope. Owen returned the next afternoon carrying a small basket that turned out to contain fresh bread, hard cheese, and 2 apples. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might not have had proper lunch," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Figured we could eat while we work." They settled at the table and Francesca divided the food between them, trying not to notice how her single plate and cup looked shabby compared to the generous meal he had brought. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before resuming their work on the altar cloth, Owen's large hands once again covering hers, creating an island of stillness in the storm of her damaged nerves. "Tell me about the mountains," Francesca said as they worked. "What is it like up there?" Owen was quiet for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. Quiet. So quiet sometimes you can hear your own heart beating. The air is thin and cold, even in summer, and everything smells like pine and clean water. In the morning, the valleys fill with mist, and when the sun comes up, it turns everything gold and pink, colors so bright they don't look real. His voice took on a distant quality, and Francesca could tell he was seeing it in his mind as he spoke. "There are places up there where you can stand on a ridge and see for 100 miles in every direction, nothing but mountains and sky and the occasional eagle riding the thermals. Makes you feel small, but in a good way. Like your problems are small too, compared to all that bigness. It sounds beautiful. It is, but it is also lonely. Took me years to admit that, but it is true. You can love the wild and still need people, still need connection." His hands tightened slightly over hers. Still need someone to share the sunrise with, instead of just seeing it alone. Francesca felt her pulse quicken. They had only known each other for a day, but something was building between them, something that felt inevitable and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, wanted to know everything about this mountain man who had appeared in her doorway like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to voice. "What will you do now that you have come down from the mountains?" she asked instead. "I have been thinking about that. I have some money saved, enough to buy land if I'm careful about it. Thought I might try my hand at ranching, maybe raise horses like my brother. Find a place with good water and grass, build something that lasts." He paused. "Build something worth coming home to." They worked until the light failed again, completing the altar cloth just as the sun disappeared behind the buildings across the street. Francesca held up their work in the candlelight, examining the neat, even stitches that marched along the hem. Perfect. Better than perfect. It looked like the work of someone whose hands had never known trembling, someone whole and capable and reliable. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for what she was feeling. "I could not have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. You did do it. I just helped you get out of your own way." Owen stood but made no move toward the door. "Miss Garrett, I wonder if I might ask you something." "Francesca," she said. "Please call me Francesca." "Francesca." He said her name carefully, like he was tasting it. "Would you be willing to have dinner with me tomorrow evening? Proper dinner at the hotel restaurant where people can see us being respectable and Mrs. Henderson cannot accuse me of improper intentions." Francesca felt a smile spread across her face, the first real smile she had felt in longer than she could remember. I would like that very much. Good. That is good. Owen reached out as if to touch her hand, then seemed to think better of it and settled his hat on his head instead. I will call for you at 6 if that suits. After he left, Francesca carefully folded the altar cloth and placed it in her satchel to deliver to Mrs. Henderson in the morning. Then she stood at her window, watching the street below as Owen's tall figure disappeared into the evening crowd, and wondered what it meant that a man she barely knew could make her feel steadier than she had felt in 2 years. Wondered if it was possible to fall in love in the space of 2 afternoons. Wondered if she was being a fool to let herself hope. She slept better that night than she had in months. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in St. Joe, with real glass in the windows and tablecloths that looked white even in lamplight. Francesca wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that had survived the war years through careful mending and strategic alterations. It was far from fashionable, but it was clean and fit her well, and when Owen arrived at her door at precisely 6 o'clock, the look on his face told her she had chosen correctly. He had cleaned up, too, his dark hair still damp from washing, his buckskin pants replaced with wool trousers, and a white shirt that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. He looked uncomfortable in the civilized clothes, but handsome in a rough-hewn way that made Francesca's heart skip. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and offered her his arm. They walked to the hotel through streets busy with early evening traffic, and Francesca was acutely aware of the curious looks they drew. St. Joe was a small enough town that everyone noticed everything, and a mountain man escorting the war nurse to dinner would be tomorrow's gossip before breakfast. But Owen seemed unbothered by the attention, and his steady presence at her side made her feel braver than she had in a long time. The hotel manager seated them at a table near the window, and they ordered roast chicken and potatoes and green beans that Francesca suspected had been put up in jars last autumn. It was still the finest meal she had seen in recent memory, and she had to resist the urge to eat too quickly, to savor each bite instead of devouring it like a starving person. "Tell me about the nursing," Owen said after they had eaten in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "What made you volunteer?" Francesca set down her fork, considering the question. Most people asked about the war in lurid tones, wanting horror stories they could share at their own dinner tables. But Owen's question sounded genuine, like he actually wanted to understand. "My father and brother enlisted in '62 with the Missouri Regiment. Father was a doctor, and he wrote to me about the conditions in the field hospitals, about how desperately they needed help. I had always assisted him at home with his practice, so I knew basic nursing, how to clean wounds and set simple breaks and mix medicines. Seemed like I should go where I was needed." She picked up her water glass, watching the candlelight reflect off the surface. "I thought I would be there for a few months, maybe a year. But once you are in it, once you see how much need there is, it becomes impossible to leave. Every time I thought about going home, another wave of wounded would arrive, and I would think, just one more week, just one more month. And then my father took ill with fever and died, and my brother fell at Shiloh, and suddenly there was no home to go back to anyway." "I am sorry," Owen said quietly. "That's a hell of a thing to lose." "Yes." Francesca met his eyes. "But I suppose you understand something about loss, about having the shape of your life change in ways you never expected." "I do. Lost my pa to a heart that gave out while he was plowing the back field. One minute he was walking behind the mules, the next he was on the ground, gone before I could run from the barn to reach him. Ma never really recovered from it. She kept going, kept taking care of me and my brother, but the light went out of her eyes. When she finally passed 3 years ago, part of me was relieved because it meant she was with Pa again, and maybe that light would come back." They talked through the meal and dessert, sharing pieces of their histories like offerings, building something fragile and precious between them. Francesca learned that Owen could read and write, taught by his mother who had been a school teacher before marrying his father. That he played harmonica, badly, but with enthusiasm. That he had once tracked a wounded grizzly for 3 days through a blizzard to put it out of its misery. That he believed in God, but thought church buildings were silly when you could worship just as well under open sky. Owen learned that Francesca had wanted to be a teacher before the war, that she loved poetry but had a terrible singing voice, that she once stole a pie from a windowsill when she was 7 and felt guilty about it for years, that she missed her father's laugh more than anything else he had left behind, that she sometimes woke in the night still hearing the screams of dying men and had to walk the floors of her small room until dawn before the memories released her. When the meal was finished and Owen had settled the bill, they walked slowly back toward Francesca's boarding house, taking the long way through streets that were quieter now. Most families settled in for the evening. The spring night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the town's lamps, and Francesca found herself wishing the walk could last longer, wishing she could freeze this moment, this feeling of connection and possibility, before reality intruded again. "I meant what I said about finding land," Owen said as they turned onto her street. "I have been looking at properties east of town, along the river. There is a piece there, about 80 acres, with good grass and timber and a creek that runs year-round. Owner is willing to sell for a fair price." "That sounds like a fine piece of land." "It is. Big enough to build something real. A house, barn, maybe some corrals for horses." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "Big enough for a future, if I could find someone who wanted to build that future with me." Francesca's breath caught. They had known each other for 3 days. It was too soon, too fast, completely improper by any reasonable standard, but nothing about her life had followed reasonable standards since the war started, and when she looked at Owen Pierce standing before her with hope and vulnerability written across his weathered face, she felt something inside her chest crack open. "That is a significant undertaking," she said carefully. "Building a future, it requires a lot of work, a lot of trust." "It does. And I know I have no right to ask. Know that you deserve someone refined who understands civilized ways, not a man who has spent the last 10 years living like a hermit in the mountains. But Francesca, I feel something when I am with you. Something I have never felt before. Like maybe all the years of being alone were preparing me to recognize the right person when I finally met her." Francesca felt tears prick her eyes. "I feel it too. And it terrifies me, because I have spent 2 years teaching myself not to hope, not to imagine futures that probably will not come true. Safer to keep my head down, to focus on just getting through each day. That is no way to live. No, but it is a way to survive." Owen reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took both of her hands in his. They were trembling badly, her nerves responding to the emotional intensity of the moment, but his steady grip quieted them almost immediately. "I am not asking you to marry me tonight," he said. "I am not asking you to make any promises you are not ready to make. I am just asking if you might be willing to see where this leads. To spend time with me, let me court you proper, and see if what we are both feeling is real or just the loneliness talking. And if it is real, then we will figure out the rest together, one day at a time, one decision at a time, with no pressure and no expectations beyond being honest with each other." His thumbs traced gentle circles across the backs of her hands. "What do you say?" Francesca looked down at their joined hands, at the way his large, scarred fingers wrapped around hers, creating stillness where there had only been chaos. She thought about the altar cloth and the quiet intimacy of working beside him. Thought about the way he listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. Thought about the possibility of waking up to mountain sunrises with someone who understood both the beauty and the loneliness of big, empty spaces. "All right," she whispered. "Yes. I would like to see where this leads." The smile that spread across Owen's face transformed it completely, erasing years of hardship and solitude, revealing the younger man he must have been before life carved lines into his features. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, formally, and then walked her the rest of the way to her door. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow." Francesca watched him walk away into the darkness, and when she finally climbed the stairs to her small room, she found herself already counting the hours until she would see him again. The courtship that followed was both entirely proper and deeply unconventional. Owen called on Francesca every day, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers from the prairie or interesting stones from the river, things that cost nothing but showed he had been thinking of her. They took walks along the riverbank, attended a church social where Owen looked supremely uncomfortable, surrounded by chattering townspeople, and spent long afternoons at Francesca's table where she taught him more refined needlework stitches, and he taught her to read weather signs in cloud formations. On days when her hands trembled too badly for delicate work, Owen simply held them until the shaking stopped, never making her feel broken or weak, just steadily present until she found her balance again. On days when his restlessness grew too strong, when Francesca could see the wild calling him back, she would suggest a long walk outside of town where he could breathe easier, where the buildings did not press in quite so close. They were good for each other, she realized. Her calm steadiness soothing his rough edges, his solid strength giving her something reliable to lean against. Together, they were more than the sum of their damaged parts. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Owen took Francesca to see the land he wanted to buy. They rode in a borrowed wagon east of St. Joe, following the river through country that grew wilder with each passing mile. When Owen finally pulled the horses to a stop, Francesca understood immediately why this place had called to him. The property spread out before them in a gentle valley between low hills, the land rolling and green with new spring growth. The creek Owen had mentioned ran clear and cold through the center of the property, lined with cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. To the north, a stand of oak and hickory provided timber for building. To the south, open grassland stretched toward the horizon, perfect for grazing. And everywhere there was space, the kind of breathing room that a man raised in mountains would need to feel settled. "What do you think?" Owen asked, helping her down from the wagon. Francesca turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. She could see it already in her mind, the house tucked into the hillside where it would be sheltered from winter winds, a barn near the creek, corrals spreading out from there, gardens near the house where she could grow vegetables and herbs, maybe an orchard on the southern slope where the sun would be strongest, a life-taking shape where there was currently only grass and sky and possibility. "I think it is perfect," she said. Owen took her hand, and they walked down to the creek together, following the bank until they reached a spot where the water pooled deep and clear beneath overhanging branches. He helped her sit on a fallen log, then sat beside her, their shoulders touching, both of them staring at the water as it caught the afternoon sunlight. "I put an offer on the property," Owen said. "Owner accepted this morning. I will sign the papers next week." Francesca's heart leapt. "Owen, that is wonderful." "Francesca." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "I know we have only known each other a short time. I know by all rights I should wait longer, do this more properly. But I am 32 years old, and I have spent the last decade alone in the mountains, and now that I have found you, I do not want to waste another day pretending I do not know what I want." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a single small ruby set into it. "This was my grandmother's ring. Ma gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for the right woman. Francesca, you are the right woman. You are the only woman. Will you marry me? Will you help me build something real here, something that lasts?" Francesca looked at the ring, then at Owen's face, at the hope and vulnerability and absolute certainty she saw there. She thought about all the reasons she should say no. They barely knew each other. He had no steady employment yet. She had no dowry, no family, nothing to bring to a marriage, except her damaged hands and her nightmares and her desperate need to prove she could still be useful. Every practical consideration argued for waiting, for caution, for protecting her heart. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, yes. Owen's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and the sight of his trembling made Francesca love him even more. He was not always steady either. He was human and flawed and trying his best, just like her. They would figure out how to be steady together. He kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise, and Francesca wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers and laughed, the sound pure joy. "When?" he asked. "Soon, as soon as we can arrange it properly." They were married 4 weeks later in the same church, whose altar cloth Francesca had mended, with Mrs. Henderson and half the town in attendance. Francesca wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself during the evenings when her hands were steady enough for the detailed work, each stitch a small act of faith in the future she was building. Owen wore his wool trousers and white shirt, his hair trimmed but still long enough to brush his collar, looking both civilized and wild at the same time. When the minister asked if Owen would take Francesca to be his wife, his "I do" rang through the small church with absolute conviction. When Francesca said the same words back to him, her voice shook only slightly, and Owen's steady gaze anchored her through the moment. They exchanged the rings Owen had purchased, simple matching gold bands, since Francesca insisted on saving his grandmother's ruby for special occasions. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss Owen gave her made Mrs. Henderson fan herself and smile. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, the same place where they had shared their first meal together. And if Francesca's hands trembled when Owen helped her out of her wedding dress, he simply held them still and whispered, "I am here," until she found her courage again. He was gentle and patient and reverent, treating her like something precious, and when she woke the next morning, wrapped in his arms with sunlight streaming through the window, she felt more whole than she had in years. They moved to the property 2 days later, camping in a sturdy tent Owen had brought down from the mountains while they worked on building their house. Owen proved to be an excellent carpenter, his hands as skilled with hammer and saw as they were with rifle and trap, and Francesca learned quickly how to mix mortar and hold boards steady while he nailed them into place. They worked from sunrise to sunset, taking breaks only to eat and rest, both of them driven by the desire to have walls and a roof before summer's heat arrived in earnest. The house took shape slowly, one board at a time, one stone at a time. It was not large, just 3 rooms to start, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom, and a small storage room that could later become another bedroom if needed. But it was solid and well built, with good tight joints and a stone fireplace that Owen constructed with painstaking care. When they finally moved out of the tent and spent their first night in the house, sleeping on a simple rope bed with a mattress Francesca had stuffed with prairie grass, she felt like she had finally come home. The first year of their marriage was hard work from dawn to dusk. Owen built a barn and corrals while Francesca established gardens and put in a small orchard of apple and cherry saplings she purchased from a traveling nursery. They acquired their first horses, a breeding pair of sturdy quarter horses that Owen had carefully selected for temperament and soundness, and began the slow process of building a herd. Money was tight and luxuries non-existent, but they had each other, and they had land, and they had a future stretching out before them. Francesca's hands still trembled, though less frequently as time passed. She learned her triggers, learned that exhaustion and stress made it worse, that steady routine and Owen's presence made it better. On bad days, Owen would find her in the garden or at the stove and simply hold her hands until the shaking passed, never asking questions, never making her feel ashamed. On good days, she could sew for hours, taking in mending work from town to bring in extra money, her stitches as neat and even as they had been before the war. Owen struggled too, though in different ways. Some mornings he would wake restless and pacing, needing to walk the property boundaries or ride out to the high ground where he could see for miles. Francesca learned to recognize these moods, learned to pack him food and send him out with a kiss, and trust that he would come back. He always did, usually by evening, calmer and more settled, ready to wrap her in his arms and tell her about the deer he had seen, or the fox den he had discovered, or the way the light hit the hills at sunset. They were learning each other, learning how to be married, learning how to build a life together from the raw materials of land and love and stubborn determination. In the spring of their second year together, Francesca realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had seen too many women die in childbirth during the war, too many babies lost to fever or mishap or simple bad luck. But when she told Owen, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears quieted, at least for a moment. "We are going to have a baby," he said, gathering her into his arms and spinning her around despite her protests. "Francesca, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see he was. Happy does not begin to cover it. Terrified, yes, but so happy I could burst with it. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Francesca found that her hands trembled more frequently during the first few months when nausea and exhaustion dogged her every step. Owen hovered like a mother hen, trying to take over all her usual chores until she finally snapped at him that she was pregnant, not dying, and perfectly capable of feeding chickens and pulling weeds. They found their balance eventually, Owen doing the heavy work while Francesca handled what she could and rested when her body demanded it. In November of 1869, during the first real snowfall of winter, Francesca went into labor. Owen rode to town through the storm to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Sarah who had delivered half the babies in the county. He barely made it back before the baby arrived, bursting through the door with Sarah in tow just as Francesca entered the final stages of labor. Owen held her hand through all of it, his face pale but determined, and when the baby finally arrived squalling and red-faced and perfect, he had tears streaming down his face. A boy. They had a son. "What should we name him?" Francesca asked, exhausted but elated, holding the tiny bundle against her chest. "I was thinking Thomas, after my pa," Owen said, running one gentle finger down the baby's cheek. "Thomas Pierce. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect." Thomas was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up most nights and filled their house with noise and chaos and a love so fierce it sometimes frightened Francesca with its intensity. Owen proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with their son, spending hours walking the floors with Thomas when he was fussy, singing to him in a surprisingly pleasant baritone voice. Watching her mountain man husband cradling their tiny son, Francesca felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. The years rolled forward, each one bringing changes and growth. The horse herd expanded as Owen's reputation for breeding quality animals spread through the territory. They added another room to the house when Francesca became pregnant again, and their daughter Rose was born in the spring of 1872, as beautiful and fierce as her namesake flower. 2 years later came another son, James, who had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. Through it all, Francesca and Owen remained partners in every sense of the word. They made decisions together, fought occasionally, but always made up before sleeping angry, and built their ranch into something substantial and lasting. The trembling in Francesca's hands never completely disappeared, but it became just another part of who she was, like Owen's restless need for open spaces, or Thomas's quick temper, or Rose's stubborn refusal to wear shoes unless absolutely necessary. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen surprised Francesca by taking her back to the spot by the creek where he had proposed. The property looked completely different now, the house expanded and well-established, the barn surrounded by corrals full of horses, gardens and orchard thriving. But this spot by the creek remained unchanged, still quiet and peaceful, their secret place. 10 years, Owen said, pulling Francesca down to sit beside him on the same fallen log, which had weathered and silvered with time but remained solid. Sometimes it feels like 10 minutes, sometimes like a whole lifetime. Both, Francesca said, leaning her head against his shoulder. It feels like both. Do you ever regret it, saying yes when I asked you to marry me after knowing each other for such a short time? Francesca lifted her head to look at him, surprised by the question. Never, not once. Do you? God, no. Best decision I ever made, asking you. Second best decision was coming down from those mountains when I did. If I had waited another year, another month, you might have married someone else and I would have missed my chance. I would not have married anyone else. I was barely surviving when you found me, Owen, barely keeping my head above water. You saved me in more ways than just helping with that altar cloth. You saved me right back, Owen said, taking her hand and pressing it against his chest, over his heart. I did not even realize how lost I was until I found you. Did not realize how much of myself I had left behind in those mountains until you helped me find it again. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the water flow past, listening to the birds in the trees and the distant sound of their children playing near the house. Their lives were not perfect. Money was still sometimes tight. The work was endless. Thomas was entering the difficult teenage years, and Rose had inherited both her parents' stubborn streaks and weaponized them regularly. But it was a good life, a rich life, full of love and purpose and the satisfaction of building something together. I want to show you something, Francesca said, reaching into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a folded piece of cloth, yellowed with age, but still recognizable as a section of the altar cloth they had mended together all those years ago. Mrs. Henderson gave this to me last month. The church replaced the altar cloth finally, and she cut out the section we worked on and saved it for me. Thought I might want to remember." Owen took the fabric carefully, running his thumb over the neat stitches they had created with their joined hands. "As if either of us could forget." "No. But I like having something tangible to remind me of that moment, of you walking into my life and holding my hands steady and saying, 'I'm here.'" Francesca took the cloth back and refolded it carefully. "Those 3 words changed everything for me. Made me believe that maybe I was not broken beyond repair, that maybe with the right person beside me, I could be whole again. You were always whole. Francesca, you just could not see it until someone else showed you." They stayed by the creek until the sun began to set, then walked hand in hand back to the house where their children waited, their future written in the land they had tamed, and the family they had built, and the love that had carried them through every challenge. It was not the ending Francesca would have imagined for herself 10 years ago, when her hands shook too badly to thread a needle and her future seemed impossibly bleak. But it was an ending she would choose again and again if given the chance. 20 years after their wedding, Francesca stood in the doorway of their expanded house, watching as Owen worked with their oldest son Thomas in the main corral. Thomas was 20 now, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, preparing to start his own ranch on the property's southern section. Owen had gifted him 20 acres in breeding stock to start, wanting to make sure his son had the same chance he had been given. Rose, 18 now and beautiful, sat on the porch rail, mending harness leather with quick, capable hands. She had inherited her mother's skill with needle and thread, though she preferred working with leather and practical items rather than delicate fabrics. She was also courting a young man from town, a blacksmith's son who seemed appropriately terrified of Owen's reputation and respectfully admiring of Rose's fierce independence. James, 16, was somewhere in the pasture checking on a mare that was close to foaling. He had his father's way with horses, able to gentle even the most fractious animal with patience and soft words. Owen said James would be the one to take over the main ranch operation eventually, that he had the temperament and skill for it. Francesca held her hands out in front of her, examining them in the afternoon light. They trembled still, some days worse than others, but she had long since made peace with it. The trembling was part of her story, part of what had brought Owen into her life, part of what made her who she was. She no longer saw it as a weakness or a failing, just another characteristic, like the silver threading through her dark hair or the laugh lines around her eyes. Owen finished with Thomas and walked toward the house, his gait still strong and confident despite the years, his hair now more silver than dark, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. When he reached the porch, he climbed the steps and wrapped his arms around Francesca from behind, resting his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am. How different my life could have been if you had not knocked on my door that day." "Fate," Owen said. "Mrs. Henderson always claimed it was fate that brought me to town exactly when you needed help, said God works in mysterious ways." Maybe she was right? They stood together as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Francesca of Owen's descriptions of mountain sunrises. Their land spread out before them, marked now with their years of work and love and dedication. The ranch was thriving, their children healthy and strong, their marriage deeper and richer than Francesca could have imagined possible during those early days when everything felt tentative and new. That evening, after dinner, when the children had scattered to their various evening tasks, Owen and Francesca sat on the porch as they did most nights, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Owen took Francesca's hand, feeling the familiar tremor in her fingers, and covered it with both of his own until the shaking quieted. "Still works," he said, smiling at her. "Always does. Do you remember what I said to you that first night, when I held your hands for the first time? I am here. You said I am here. I am still here, Francesca, still holding your hand steady, still grateful every single day that you let me into your life." Francesca turned to face him fully, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her still trembling hands. "And I am still here, being grateful right back. We built something good, Owen, something real and lasting, exactly like you promised we would." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of 20 years of partnership and love, and when he pulled back, they were both smiling. The future stretched out before them, uncertain as all futures are, but they would face it the same way they had faced everything else, together, hand in hand. One steady day at a time. Their story could have ended 1,000 different ways. Francesca could have refused Owen's help that first day, could have been too proud or too frightened to accept his presence in her small room. Owen could have stayed in the mountains, convinced that solitude was safer than connection, that wild places were easier to navigate than human hearts. But they had both chosen differently. Had chosen to be brave, to be vulnerable, to reach for something better even when it felt impossible. And in making those choices, they had not just saved each other. They had built a life worth saving, a love worth fighting for, a family that would carry their story forward long after they were gone. Years later, when Thomas brought his own children to visit the ranch that had become a substantial horse breeding operation known throughout the territory, he would tell them stories about their grandparents, about how their grandfather had been a mountain man who came down from the high country and fell in love with a war nurse whose hands shook so badly she could not thread a needle. About how he held her hand steady and said 3 simple words that changed both of their lives. About how they built a ranch and a family, and a love that lasted through decades of hard work and joy and sorrow and triumph. The children would listen wide-eyed, not quite believing that their sweet grandmother who baked the best apple pie in Missouri and their gruff grandfather who could gentle any horse had once been young and broken and finding their way toward each other through pain and hope and stubborn determination. But it was all true, every word of it. And on summer evenings when the light turned golden and the shadows grew long across the ranch that Thomas now operated with his father's guidance, he would sometimes see his parents sitting on the porch as they always had, his father's large hands covering his mother's trembling ones, both of them looking out at everything they had built together, silent, content, still choosing each other after all these years, still saying, in 1,000 unspoken ways, "I am here." The final chapter of Francesca and Owen's story did not come for many years yet. They lived to see all 3 of their children married and settled, lived to hold grandchildren and watch the ranch expand into something beyond what either of them could have imagined that day by the creek when Owen first proposed. They lived through droughts and floods, through economic panics and harsh winters, through all the challenges that a life on the frontier threw at them. And through it all, when Francesca's hands trembled, Owen held them steady. When Owen's restlessness grew too strong, Francesca gave him space to roam and welcomed him home with open arms. They were partners in the truest sense, balancing each other, supporting each other, loving each other through every season. When Owen finally passed at age 78, dying peacefully in his sleep after a long life well lived, Francesca held his hand one final time and whispered the same words he had spoken to her so many years before. "I am here. I am here." She lived 3 more years without him, long enough to ensure the ranch would continue prosperously, long enough to share her stories with grandchildren who would remember them and pass them along. And when she joined Owen in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, her children buried her beside him with a headstone that read simply, "She was never broken, just learning to be whole." The ranch continued for generations, eventually growing into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in Missouri, known for producing animals of exceptional quality and temperament. The Pierce name became synonymous with integrity and skill, carrying forward the legacy that Owen and Francesca had begun with nothing but raw land and raw hope. But more than the ranch, more than the business success or the land holdings or the family name, what endured was the story. The story of a mountain man and a war nurse who found each other when they both desperately needed finding, who built something beautiful from their broken pieces, who proved that love does not require perfection, just presence, just someone willing to hold your hand steady when they shake, just someone willing to say, and mean, "I am here." And that story, told and retold around dinner tables and on front porches and in quiet moments between parents and children for generations to come, became the real inheritance that Francesca and Owen left behind. Not just land or livestock or money, but the knowledge that even the most damaged among us can heal, that even the loneliest among us can find home, that sometimes salvation comes not from fixing what is broken, but from finding someone who loves us precisely because of our cracks, not despite them. In the end, that is what made their story worth telling. Not that it was extraordinary, though in many ways it was, but that it was possible. That two people who had every reason to give up on love and connection and hope instead chose to reach for it, to fight for it, to build a life around it. They chose each other. Every single day, through decades of choices big and small, they chose each other. And in doing so, they proved that the best love stories are not about perfect people finding perfect happiness. They are about broken people finding each other and deciding that together they can be whole. On spring mornings, when the light hits the ranch just right and the wind carries the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard Francesca planted over 100 years ago, locals swear you can sometimes see two figures sitting on the hill by the family cemetery. A tall man with broad shoulders and a woman whose hands rest peacefully in his, both of them looking out over the valley they claimed and tamed and loved. It is probably just a trick of the light, just shadows and wishful thinking, and the human tendency to see meaning in random patterns. But maybe not. Maybe some love stories are so strong, so true, that they linger even after the lovers are gone. Maybe some promises, once made with absolute conviction, echo forward through time. Maybe some hands, once joined, remain that way forever. I am here. Those 3 words, spoken in a small room above a general store in St. Joe, Missouri in the spring of 1867 by a mountain man to a woman whose hands would not stop shaking. Those 3 words that changed everything. Those 3 words that built a life, a family, a legacy. Those 3 words that remind us all, whenever we feel lost or broken or too damaged to be loved, that somewhere out there, if we are brave enough to keep looking, keep hoping, keep reaching, there might be someone ready to take our trembling hands in theirs and speak the same promise. I am here. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, that is all we need to begin again.